The most dangerous man in the room is usually the one nobody notices. The words would not make sense to anyone inside Redstone Correctional Facility that morning, but before the week was over, dozens of inmates would remember them. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual noise of trays sliding across metal rails, conversations echoing against concrete walls, and officers watching from a distance. It looked like any other day. Marcus Reed preferred it that way. At 56 years old, the quiet black inmate had mastered the art of being invisible. He moved through the prison with calm efficiency, speaking only when necessary and never drawing attention to himself. Most inmates could not remember hearing him raise his voice. Many had never heard him say more than a few sentences at a time. Every morning followed the same routine. Breakfast, a book from the library, a walk through the recreation yard, then another book. Marcus carried himself with a quiet discipline that few people noticed and even fewer understood. On that particular morning, he stood in line waiting for breakfast with a paperback novel tucked under one arm. His posture was relaxed. His expression revealed nothing. Several spots behind him stood Ryan Carter, one of the most confident inmates in Redstone. At 35 years old, Ryan had built a reputation around making sure everyone knew exactly who he was. He enjoyed attention. He enjoyed being the loudest voice in a room. Most of all, he enjoyed reminding other inmates where they stood. A few men near him laughed at a joke he had just made. Ryan grinned and glanced around the cafeteria, enjoying the audience. Then his eyes landed on Marcus. The older inmate was standing quietly, completely unaware or completely uninterested. Ryan could not tell which. For some reason, that irritated him. There was something about people who refused to react that made him uncomfortable. He stepped forward as the line moved. Marcus remained focused on the book beneath his arm. A moment later, Ryan deliberately bumped into him with enough force to push him several steps forward. The movement was sudden. Trays rattled. Several nearby inmates turned to look. Marcus caught his balance immediately. He never dropped the book. He never raised his voice. He simply turned and looked at Ryan. The cafeteria grew noticeably quieter. Ryan smirked. He expected anger, maybe embarrassment. At the very least, some kind of reaction. Instead, Marcus studied him for several seconds with calm eyes. The older man looked neither afraid nor offended. That somehow felt worse. Ryan folded his arms. "Got a problem?" he asked. Several inmates watched closely. Even a few officers glanced in their direction. Marcus remained silent for a moment. Then he spoke in a calm voice that barely rose above the surrounding noise. "No." Ryan laughed. "That is what I thought." He expected the conversation to end there. Instead, Marcus adjusted the book beneath his arm and added one more sentence. "Just remember that every choice teaches you something about yourself." The words were simple. There was no threat in them. No anger. No attempt to sound clever. Yet something about the way Marcus said them caused the laughter around Ryan to fade. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Ryan felt an unfamiliar discomfort settle into his chest. He immediately pushed it away. "Whatever that means," he muttered. Marcus simply nodded and turned back toward the serving line. The moment passed. Conversations slowly resumed. Trays continued moving. Breakfast was served. Yet several inmates found themselves glancing toward the silent older man sitting alone at a table near the window. Among them was a younger inmate named Ethan Brooks. He had witnessed the entire exchange. What stayed with him was not the shove. It was Marcus's reaction. Most people in prison reacted to everything. Respect, disrespect, rumors, arguments. Marcus reacted to almost nothing. Ethan watched the older man open his book while eating breakfast as though nothing unusual had happened. Across the room, Ryan sat with several friends and laughed loudly, but every few minutes he caught himself looking in Marcus's direction. Something about the encounter bothered him. He could not explain why. Meanwhile, Marcus calmly turned another page. Outside the cafeteria windows, the morning sun rose over the prison yard. The day had only just begun, and although nobody realized it yet, a simple moment in a breakfast line had started a chain of events that would change how Redstone viewed the silent inmate forever. The morning after the incident in the cafeteria, most inmates had already moved on to new rumors, new complaints, and new distractions. That was usually how life worked inside Redstone Correctional Facility. One day something felt important. The next day it disappeared. Yet Ryan Carter found himself thinking about Marcus Reed more than he wanted to admit. It irritated him. During breakfast, he caught himself scanning the room until he spotted the older inmate sitting alone near the same window. Marcus was reading again. The sight somehow made Ryan even more annoyed. Most people who got embarrassed in front of others tried to avoid attention afterward. Marcus behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. He read his book. He ate his breakfast. He seemed completely unaffected. Ryan shook his head and sat with his usual group. One of the inmates at the table smirked. "Your friend is back." Ryan glanced toward Marcus. "He is not my friend." The others laughed. Another inmate leaned forward. "That old guy is strange." Ryan nodded. "I noticed." Across the room, Marcus calmly turned another page. He never looked toward Ryan's table. He never seemed interested in what anyone thought about him. Later that morning, inmates gathered in the recreation yard beneath a bright blue sky. Some walked laps. Others played cards at outdoor tables. A few simply sat in the sun, enjoying a break from the routine of prison life. Marcus sat on a bench beneath a shaded area with the same paperback novel resting in his hands. Ethan Brooks noticed him immediately. The younger inmate had spent most of the previous evening replaying the cafeteria incident in his mind. The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. Nobody stayed that calm. Not in prison. Curiosity finally won. Ethan walked across the yard and stopped near the bench. "Mind if I sit here?" Marcus looked up from the book and smiled slightly. "It is a free country." Ethan laughed. "Not exactly." Marcus closed the book. "Fair point." Ethan sat down. For several moments, neither man spoke. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable. Finally, Ethan said, "You are not what I expected." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Neither are you." Ethan smiled. "Most people would have been angry yesterday." Marcus looked toward the open yard. "Angry about what?" Ethan stared at him. "You know what?" Marcus thought for a moment. "I learned a long time ago that anger is expensive." Ethan frowned. "Expensive?" Marcus nodded. "It costs time, energy, focus, usually more than people realize." The answer only created more questions. Before Ethan could ask another one, an announcement echoed across the yard. Recreation would continue for another hour. Around them, conversations resumed. Marcus opened his book again. Ethan watched him carefully. Something seemed unusual. Not just his calm attitude. Everything. The way he sat. The way he moved. Even the way he held the book. There was a precision to it that Ethan could not explain. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the yard, Ryan noticed Ethan sitting beside Marcus. That surprised him. Most inmates barely acknowledged the older man. Now someone was actually choosing to spend time with him. Ryan watched for several minutes before eventually looking away. Yet the image stayed in his mind. Later that afternoon, inmates returned to their housing units. Marcus walked through the corridor carrying 2 books from the library. As he passed a group of inmates, one accidentally dropped a stack of papers. The pages scattered across the floor. Without hesitation, Marcus knelt and helped gather them. The entire thing took less than a minute. Then he continued walking. No speech. No lecture. No attempt to impress anyone. Ethan happened to witness the moment from farther down the hall. Once again, Marcus acted differently from almost everyone else in prison. Most people wanted recognition. Marcus seemed interested only in doing what needed to be done. That evening, as lights dimmed throughout Redstone, Ethan found himself staring at the ceiling above his bunk. One question kept returning to his mind. Who exactly was Marcus Reed before he came to this place? Because the more Ethan observed him, the more convinced he became that the quiet man carrying books through the prison corridors was hiding a story nobody had discovered yet. By the end of the week, Ethan Brooks had developed a routine he never planned on having. Every morning after breakfast, he found himself looking for Marcus Reed. Not because Marcus encouraged conversation. In fact, the older inmate seemed perfectly comfortable spending entire afternoons alone. Yet the more Ethan observed him, the more questions appeared. Most people inside Redstone Correctional Facility followed predictable patterns. They complained about the same things. They reacted to the same situations. They carried themselves in ways that revealed exactly who they were. Marcus was different. On Friday morning, Ethan noticed something unusual during recreation time. The prison yard had just opened. Inmates slowly spread across the concrete walkways and grassy sections enclosed by tall fences. Some headed toward the basketball court. Others gathered around picnic tables. Marcus walked alone along the outer track that circled the yard. Ethan watched from a distance. At first, nothing seemed remarkable. Then he noticed the timing. Marcus moved at the same pace every lap. Not approximately the same pace. Exactly the same pace. His steps never hurried. Never slowed. Every turn looked deliberate. Every movement looked practiced. Ethan checked the yard clock out of curiosity. 10 minutes later, Marcus completed another lap at virtually the exact same moment. The consistency was almost mechanical. "What are you looking at?" another inmate asked while sitting beside Ethan. Ethan nodded toward Marcus. "That guy." The inmate shrugged. "The old man." Ethan nodded. "Something about him seems different." The inmate glanced across the yard. "He reads books." "That is not exactly a mystery." Ethan smiled but continued watching. It was not the books. It was everything else. Later that afternoon, Ethan found Marcus sitting beneath a tree near the far corner of the yard. A thick hardcover book rested on his lap. Ethan approached carefully. "Mind if I ask you something?" Marcus looked up and smiled. "You already are." Ethan laughed despite himself. "Fair enough." He sat down nearby. "How do you stay so calm all the time?" Marcus considered the question. "Practice." "Practice?" Marcus nodded. "Most things improve with repetition." Ethan leaned back. "That sounds simple." "Most important things are." Ethan shook his head. "Not in here." Marcus looked around the yard. "Especially in here." Before Ethan could continue, an officer announced that recreation time would end in 15 minutes. Around them, inmates began gathering their belongings. Marcus calmly closed his book and stood. Ethan noticed something else. Despite being 56 years old, Marcus moved with unusual balance. No stiffness. No hesitation. His posture remained straight. His steps looked light and controlled. It reminded Ethan of athletes he used to watch before prison. The thought lingered. That evening, another strange moment occurred in the housing unit. One of the younger inmates was attempting a simple stretching routine beside his bunk. He lost balance and nearly stumbled into a nearby locker. Marcus happened to be passing. Without stopping, he quietly offered a suggestion. "Keep your weight centered." The younger inmate adjusted his position. Immediately, his balance improved. "How did you know that?" the inmate asked. Marcus simply smiled. "Experience." Then he continued walking. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds, but Ethan witnessed the entire thing. Once again, Marcus seemed to possess knowledge that appeared unexpectedly precise. Not academic knowledge. Physical knowledge. The kind learned through years of repetition. Across the room, Ryan Carter noticed it too. He had spent days trying to ignore Marcus. Unfortunately, Marcus kept giving him reasons to pay attention. Not through attention-seeking behavior. Through the opposite. The quieter Marcus became, the more noticeable he seemed. Ryan hated that. Late that night, after lights out, Ethan lay awake thinking about everything he had seen. The perfect pacing during yard walks. The disciplined routine. The unusual balance. The effortless advice. Individually, none of those details meant much. Together, they felt significant. He stared toward the dark ceiling and replayed the scenes in his mind. Most people carried evidence of their past wherever they went. Sometimes in their words. Sometimes in their habits. Marcus rarely spoke about himself, but his habits seemed to tell a story of their own. Ethan just could not figure out what story it was. As sleep finally approached, one thought remained. Marcus Reed was not simply a quiet inmate who liked books. Somewhere beneath the silence was a lifetime of experience that nobody at Redstone seemed to understand. And for reasons Ethan could not explain, he had become determined to uncover it. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies over Redstone Correctional Facility. The weekend schedule moved at a slower pace, giving inmates more free time than usual. For most people, that meant longer conversations, card games, or extra hours in the recreation yard. For Marcus Reed, it meant exactly what every other day meant. Breakfast, reading, walking, reflection. Ethan Brooks noticed the pattern immediately. By now he had become an unofficial observer of the older inmates' routine. The more he paid attention, the more details emerged. After breakfast, Marcus visited the library. After the library, he spent 30 minutes walking the outer track. Then he sat beneath the same shaded area with a book. The consistency was remarkable. That morning, Ethan decided to stop wondering and start asking questions. He found Marcus seated beneath a tree near the edge of the yard, reading a thick history book. "Can I ask you something personal?" Ethan said. Marcus looked up with a small smile. "That depends on how personal." Ethan sat down nearby. "Have you always been this disciplined?" Marcus considered the question before closing the book. No. Ethan looked surprised. Really? Marcus nodded. Nobody starts disciplined. They become disciplined. Ethan thought about that. How? Marcus glanced toward the yard where groups of inmates were talking and laughing. By doing difficult things repeatedly until they become normal. The answer sounded simple, but Marcus delivered it with the certainty of someone speaking from experience. Before Ethan could continue, a whistle echoed across the yard. Several inmates began gathering near an exercise area where a few pull-up bars and fitness stations had been installed years earlier. Ethan noticed Marcus stand and stretch. It was a casual movement, yet something immediately caught his attention. The sleeve of Marcus's shirt shifted slightly, revealing an old scar running along his upper arm. It was not large, but it looked decades old. More interesting was Marcus's reaction. The moment he noticed the exposed scar, he calmly adjusted his sleeve and continued walking. Ethan filed the observation away. Later that afternoon, another detail appeared. During recreation, several inmates removed their shoes while relaxing on a grassy section of the yard. Marcus sat on a nearby bench reading. As he crossed one leg over the other, Ethan briefly noticed the bottom of his foot. The skin appeared unusually thick and weathered. Not injured, not damaged, just heavily conditioned. Ethan frowned. He had seen feet like that before. Years ago, his cousin had trained in competitive sports. The same kind of wear appeared after years of repetitive training. The thought lingered. Meanwhile, Ryan Carter was having his own difficulties. He had spent the week trying to convince himself that Marcus was nothing special. Yet every attempt seemed to fail. People kept gravitating toward the older inmate. Not because Marcus sought attention. Quite the opposite. People seemed drawn to his calm presence. Ryan sat with several inmates near the basketball court when one of them pointed toward Marcus. "You ever notice that guy never gets upset?" Ryan rolled his eyes. "Maybe he just does not care." The inmate shook his head. "No, it feels different than that." Ryan hated that he understood exactly what the man meant. Across the yard, Ethan approached Marcus once more. "Can I ask another question?" Marcus smiled. "You seem determined to." Ethan laughed. "What happened to your arm?" For the first time all day, Marcus paused longer than usual. His expression remained calm, but something thoughtful appeared in his eyes. He glanced briefly at the old scar beneath his sleeve. "Life happened," he said. Ethan smiled. "That is not much of an answer." Marcus opened his book again. "It is the one I am giving." Ethan shook his head and laughed. Yet as he walked away, the mystery only deepened. The scar, the discipline, the balance, the conditioned feet, the careful answers. None of it fit together yet. But Ethan was becoming increasingly certain of one thing. Marcus Reed was carrying the history of an entirely different life beneath the quiet routine of prison. And whatever that life had been, he clearly was not ready to talk about it. Sunday afternoon brought unusually warm weather to Redstone Correctional Facility. The recreation yard was crowded with inmates trying to enjoy a few hours outdoors before returning to another predictable week. Marcus Reed sat beneath his usual shaded area with a book resting on his lap. The routine had become familiar to anyone paying attention. Read, observe, listen, rarely speak. Yet on that particular afternoon, something happened that caused several people to look at him differently. Near the exercise stations, a young inmate named Tyler Jensen was attempting a workout he had recently started. Tyler was 24 years old and eager to improve himself. Unlike many inmates, he spent more time focused on personal goals than prison politics. Unfortunately, enthusiasm did not always equal experience. Ethan Brooks noticed Tyler struggling through a series of exercises, while several other inmates offered conflicting advice. One man told him to move faster. Another told him to move slower. A third suggested changing his entire routine. Within minutes, Tyler looked frustrated. His movements became increasingly awkward. Finally, he stepped away from the group and sat down near the bench where Marcus was reading. He rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. Marcus glanced up from the page. "Rough day." Tyler laughed. "Something like that." Marcus closed the book. "Too many coaches?" Tyler looked surprised. "How did you know?" Marcus smiled slightly. "You have the expression." Tyler shook his head. "Everybody keeps telling me different things." Marcus nodded. "That happens." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Tyler gestured toward the exercise area. "You seem like somebody who knows about training." Ethan, sitting several yards away, immediately paid attention. Marcus looked toward the exercise equipment before returning his gaze to Tyler. "A little." Tyler laughed. That is not an answer. Marcus smiled, but said nothing. After a brief pause, Tyler stood and demonstrated the movement he had been struggling with. It was simple, nothing dramatic. Yet Marcus studied it carefully. What happened next lasted only a few seconds. Marcus pointed toward Tyler's feet. Your balance is shifting too early. Tyler frowned. What do you mean? Marcus stood and calmly showed him a small adjustment in posture. Nothing flashy, nothing complicated, just a slight change in weight distribution. Tyler tried again. The difference was immediate. His movement looked smoother, more controlled. Tyler stopped and stared. How did you see that? Marcus shrugged. Years of paying attention. Ethan watched the exchange closely. Once again, Marcus had provided highly specific physical advice with almost no effort. Even more surprising, the advice worked instantly. Tyler repeated the movement several more times. Each repetition looked better than the last. Soon a few nearby inmates noticed. They drifted closer. One asked Marcus another question about balance. Another asked about breathing. Marcus answered each one with brief, practical observations. He never turned the conversation into a lecture. He never tried to impress anyone. Yet every answer seemed strangely precise. Across the yard, Ryan Carter noticed the growing group around Marcus. His first reaction was annoyance. His second was curiosity. He walked closer without intending to join the conversation. As he approached, he heard Marcus speaking to one of the inmates. Control comes before power. The inmate nodded thoughtfully. Ryan frowned. Something about the statement sounded familiar, though he could not place why. Meanwhile, Tyler completed another successful repetition and smiled. You should be teaching classes. Several inmates laughed. Marcus shook his head. I think there are already enough teachers in the world. The comment earned more laughter. Yet Ethan noticed something interesting. Marcus seemed completely comfortable discussing discipline, balance, movement, and training concepts. The confidence appeared effortless. Not the confidence of someone repeating information from a book. The confidence of someone who had lived it. As recreation time neared its end, the small crowd slowly dispersed. Inmates returned to conversations, games, and walks around the yard. Marcus reopened his book as though nothing unusual had happened. Tyler thanked him one last time before leaving. Ethan remained seated nearby, thinking. Another clue had appeared. Not a major clue. Not enough to solve the mystery, but enough to deepen it. The scar on Marcus's arm. The conditioned feet. The perfect balance. The disciplined routine. And now this unusual understanding of physical training. Ethan looked toward the older inmate reading quietly beneath the afternoon sun. More than ever, he felt certain that Marcus Reed had spent years mastering something. The question was what? Monday morning began like every other Monday inside Redstone Correctional Facility. The loudspeaker announced the daily schedule. Inmates moved through breakfast lines. Officers monitored the housing units. The routine was predictable, and predictability often brought comfort in prison. Yet for Ethan Brooks, the mystery surrounding Marcus Reed had become impossible to ignore. Over the weekend, he had replayed every unusual detail in his mind. The scar, the discipline, the training advice, the perfect balance. None of it fit the image of an ordinary inmate. That morning, Ethan sat in the library reviewing educational materials when Officer Daniel Cole entered carrying a stack of paperwork. Cole had worked at Redstone for nearly 20 years. He had seen thousands of inmates come and go, most blended together after enough time. Yet recently he had caught himself noticing Marcus more often. Not because Marcus caused problems. In fact, he was one of the easiest inmates to supervise. The strange part was that Marcus seemed oddly familiar. Ethan watched as Officer Cole signed several forms at the circulation desk before glancing toward a reading table near the window. Marcus sat there as usual with a book in his hands. The officer paused briefly. Something about his expression changed. It lasted less than a second. Then he continued working. Ethan noticed anyway. Later that afternoon, recreation time brought inmates back into the yard. Marcus followed his usual routine. Walking, reading, observing. Across the yard, Ryan Carter sat with several inmates discussing sports. The conversation eventually shifted toward unusual talents people had before prison. One inmate claimed he had once played minor league baseball. Another insisted he had performed in a touring band. Ryan listened with mild interest until someone mentioned Marcus. I bet the old guy used to be a teacher. Several inmates nodded. Ryan looked toward Marcus. Why? Because he talks like one. Another inmate shrugged. Maybe a coach. Ryan laughed. A coach. Yet the idea stayed with him longer than expected. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself once again sitting near Marcus beneath the shaded area. The older inmate had just finished another lap around the yard. Ethan noticed there was barely any sign of fatigue despite Marcus being older than most men in the facility. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. Marcus smiled. "You usually do." Ethan laughed. "What did you do before prison?" For the first time, Marcus looked genuinely thoughtful. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. He closed the book resting on his lap. "Many things." Ethan groaned. "That is another one of your answers." Marcus smiled. "It happens to be true." Ethan shook his head. "Were you a teacher?" "Sometimes." "A coach?" Marcus looked toward the sky. "Sometimes." Ethan laughed in frustration. "You are impossible." Marcus nodded. "That has been suggested before." The conversation ended there, but something about the exchange stayed with Ethan. Marcus had not denied being a coach. He had not denied being a teacher. He simply refused to explain further. Later that evening, Officer Cole sat alone in the administration office reviewing inmate files. The room was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. As he organized paperwork, a random thought crossed his mind. He had seen Marcus somewhere before. Not at Redstone. Long before Redstone. The feeling had been bothering him for weeks. Cole leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Where? Television? A newspaper? A conference? He could not remember. The frustration grew stronger the harder he tried. Finally, he opened the inmate database and pulled up Marcus Reed's intake photograph. The picture appeared on the screen. Cole studied it carefully. The older face was familiar, but not in its current form. Somewhere beneath the gray hair and age was another image. A younger image. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I know you from somewhere," he muttered. A few minutes later, he closed the file without finding any answers. Yet the feeling refused to disappear. Across the facility, Marcus sat quietly on his bunk reading beneath the evening lights. Around him, inmates watched television, played cards, and discussed the events of the day. Marcus remained focused on the page in front of him. He seemed completely unaware that two different people had spent most of the day trying to understand who he really was. Or perhaps he was aware and simply chose not to acknowledge it. As the housing unit gradually settled into silence, Officer Cole continued thinking about the familiar face in the inmate database. The answer remained frustratingly out of reach. But for the first time, he felt certain of one thing. Marcus Reed had not merely lived an interesting life before prison. He had lived a life important enough to be remembered. Tuesday brought steady rain to Redstone Correctional Facility. Water streaked across the windows of the housing units, turning the prison yard into a gray landscape of puddles and empty walkways. Because outdoor recreation had been canceled, most inmates spent the afternoon inside common areas searching for ways to pass the time. Television volumes increased. Card games appeared at every table. Conversations echoed through the building. Marcus Reed sat near a window with a book in his hands, seemingly unaffected by the change in routine. Ethan Brooks noticed him immediately. No matter what happened inside the prison, Marcus always seemed to find the same calm center. Ethan carried a notebook from one of his education classes and sat nearby. "Do you ever get bored?" he asked. Marcus looked up from the page. "Of course." Ethan smiled. "You do not look bored." Marcus closed the book. "Looking bored rarely improves the situation." Ethan laughed. Before he could continue, another familiar voice interrupted from across the room. "There he is." Ryan Carter approached with two inmates from his usual group. Several nearby conversations quieted slightly. Ryan had spent the past week trying to understand why Marcus bothered him so much. Every attempt produced the same result. More frustration. The older inmate never reacted the way people were supposed to react. He never appeared intimidated. He never tried to impress anyone. Most confusing of all, people seemed to respect him more each day. Ryan stopped beside the table. Marcus calmly looked up. "Afternoon." The simple greeting caught Ryan off guard. There was no sarcasm, no challenge, just a polite acknowledgement. Ryan folded his arms. "You always this relaxed?" Marcus considered the question. "Not always." Ryan pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. Ethan remained silent, sensing something important was about to happen. Several inmates nearby paid attention while pretending not to. Ryan leaned forward. "People keep acting like you are some kind of mystery." Marcus smiled faintly. "That sounds exhausting." A few inmates chuckled. Ryan ignored them. Seriously, everybody wants to know what your deal is. Marcus reopened his book. I was not aware I had a deal. More laughter followed. Ryan shook his head. You know what I mean. Marcus nodded. Probably. For a few seconds, silence settled over the table. Then Ryan asked the question directly. What did you do before prison? Ethan immediately looked up. It was the question everyone wanted answered. Marcus studied Ryan carefully. Unlike previous conversations, this one felt different. Ryan was no longer trying to show off. Beneath the attitude was genuine curiosity. Marcus finally responded. Many things. Ryan groaned. That is the same answer you give everybody. Marcus smiled. That is because it remains true. Ryan leaned back in frustration. Were you some kind of athlete? The question surprised Ethan. It surprised Marcus too, though only slightly. The older inmate raised an eyebrow. Why would you ask that? Ryan shrugged. The way you move. The way you talk about training. The way you corrected Tyler. Marcus looked down at the book resting in his hands. For a moment, he seemed almost nostalgic. Then the expression disappeared. People spend too much time looking backward. Ryan frowned. That is not an answer either. Marcus nodded. You are noticing a pattern. More laughter spread through the room. Even Ryan smiled despite himself. Then Marcus closed the book and looked directly at him. Can I ask you a question? Ryan appeared surprised. Sure. Marcus rested his hands on the cover of the book. Why does my past matter so much to you? The question immediately changed the mood. Ryan opened his mouth, then stopped. He had no quick response. Marcus continued. The person you are becoming is usually more important than the person someone used to be. The room grew quieter. Ethan wrote the sentence in his notebook without even realizing it. Ryan looked away briefly. For the first time since their cafeteria encounter, he seemed uncertain. Finally, he shrugged. Maybe. Marcus smiled. Maybe is a good place to start. A loud announcement echoed through the housing unit, signaling the next scheduled movement period. Conversations resumed. Chairs scraped against the floor. The moment ended. Ryan stood and walked away with his group, but his expression remained thoughtful. Ethan watched him leave before turning back toward Marcus. You do that on purpose, do you not? Marcus looked amused. Do what? Ethan smiled. Answer questions with other questions. Marcus opened his book once again. Only when the second question is more important than the first. Ethan shook his head and laughed. Yet as the afternoon continued and rain tapped softly against the windows, he could not stop thinking about the exchange. Ryan had asked about Marcus's past. Somehow Marcus had turned the conversation into something else entirely. And for reasons Ethan could not explain, that made the mystery surrounding the quiet inmate feel even larger than before. Wednesday morning brought clear skies back to Redstone Correctional Facility. The rain had passed, and inmates eagerly returned to the recreation yard during the first outdoor period of the day. Yet while most people focused on the weather, Ethan Brooks was focused on something else entirely. The mystery of Marcus Reed had grown too large to ignore. Every answer created new questions. Every conversation revealed another clue. Ethan had begun keeping notes in the back of one of his educational workbooks. Not because he expected to solve a crime. He simply wanted to understand the quiet inmate who seemed to know more than he ever revealed. After breakfast, Ethan headed to the library. The room was nearly empty except for a few inmates reading newspapers and several others using educational materials. As he searched for a history book he needed for class, something unusual caught his attention. A rolling cart near the back wall contained old donated magazines and newspapers waiting to be sorted. Most inmates ignored them. Ethan normally would have done the same. For reasons he could not explain, he stopped. Perhaps curiosity had taken over. Perhaps he was simply looking for a distraction. Whatever the reason, he began flipping through a stack of aging publications. Several minutes passed. Then he froze. One newspaper had a sports section folded awkwardly inside. A photograph near the bottom corner immediately caught his attention. The image showed a younger athlete standing in a ring with both arms raised. The article was old and slightly faded. Ethan leaned closer. His heart unexpectedly sped up. The athlete looked familiar. Not identical. Younger. Stronger. Decades younger. But familiar. Very familiar. Ethan stared at the face. The resemblance to Marcus Reed was impossible to ignore. Before he could read the article, another inmate approached the cart searching for magazines. Ethan quickly folded the newspaper and tucked it beneath a stack of books. He did not know why. Instinct, perhaps. Later that afternoon, he carried the paper to a quiet corner of the library and examined it more carefully. The article had been damaged over time. Portions were missing. The athlete's name had been partially obscured by a tear near the edge of the page. Ethan could make out only fragments. The story described a championship event, international competition, dedicated training, years of discipline. Several key lines remained readable. One phrase appeared repeatedly. Champion. Ethan looked again at the photograph. The younger man possessed the same calm eyes, the same posture, the same quiet confidence Marcus carried every day. Ethan felt a chill despite the warm room. Could it really be him? Across the facility, Marcus followed his normal routine, completely unaware of Ethan's discovery. He spent part of the afternoon reading beneath the shaded recreation area, while several inmates discussed sports nearby. One of them eventually asked Marcus who his favorite athlete had been growing up. Marcus smiled thoughtfully. The athletes who respected discipline more than attention. The answer sounded exactly like something Marcus would say. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Cole continued struggling with his own mystery. During a break between assignments, he found himself searching through old memories again. The familiar face refused to leave his mind. He knew he had seen Marcus somewhere long before prison, somewhere connected to accomplishment, somewhere connected to public recognition. Yet the answer remained frustratingly distant. That evening, Ethan sat alone on his bunk staring at the newspaper article spread across his lap. He compared the photograph to the image of Marcus that existed in his memory. The similarities felt undeniable. Still, one problem remained. The athlete's name was missing. Without the name, the article proved nothing. And yet Ethan could not shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something important. Very important. As lights out approached, he carefully folded the newspaper and slipped it inside one of his textbooks for safekeeping. Then he looked across the housing unit toward Marcus, who sat reading beneath the evening lights, as usual. The older inmate appeared completely ordinary. Calm, quiet, unremarkable. Yet hidden inside an old newspaper was a photograph suggesting a very different story. And for the first time, Ethan began wondering if the truth about Marcus Reed was far bigger than anyone inside Redstone had imagined. Thursday morning began with a sense of anticipation Ethan Brooks could not explain. The folded newspaper hidden inside his textbook felt heavier than it should have. He had spent most of the previous night studying the faded photograph and damaged article, searching for clues. The athlete's name remained missing, but one thing had become increasingly difficult to ignore. The face in the picture looked remarkably similar to Marcus Reed. Not identical. Tom had changed that. But the eyes were the same. The posture was the same. The calm confidence was unmistakable. During breakfast, Ethan sat across the cafeteria from Marcus and watched him quietly eat while reading a book. The older inmate looked exactly as he always did. Relaxed, unconcerned, invisible to most people. Yet Ethan now viewed him through a completely different lens. Across the room, Ryan Carter noticed Ethan staring. You planning to ask him another 100 questions today? He joked. Ethan smiled. Maybe. Ryan shook his head. I still do not understand why everyone is so interested in that guy. Ethan considered showing him the newspaper article. Instead, he decided against it. Not yet. He wanted more answers first. Later that morning, the library became unusually busy because several educational programs were preparing for upcoming evaluations. Ethan took advantage of the activity and returned to the back corner where he had discovered the newspaper. He searched through additional boxes of donated materials, hoping to find another article from the same period. Most of what he found was useless. Old advertisements, community newsletters, sports sections missing entire pages. Nearly an hour passed before something finally caught his attention. Another photograph, this one much smaller. The image quality was poor, but it appeared to show the same athlete standing beside an older coach. The caption was damaged beyond recognition. Only 2 words remained visible. International champion. Ethan stared at the page. Champion. The same word from the first article. His pulse quickened. By afternoon, rumors had already begun spreading among a small circle of inmates. Ethan had not intended to share his discovery, but curiosity had gotten the better of him. He mentioned the photograph to Tyler Jensen, who mentioned it to someone else. Within hours, several people were quietly discussing the possibility that Marcus had once been a professional athlete. Most dismissed the idea immediately. Others seemed intrigued. Ryan Carter heard the rumor during recreation. His first reaction was laughter. The guy who spends all day reading books? Yet even as he said it, he remembered the balanced advice Marcus had given Tyler. He remembered the unusual discipline. He remembered the calm confidence. For the first time, the idea did not seem completely impossible. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Cole experienced a breakthrough of his own. During a routine inventory review in the administration office, he passed a storage shelf containing old community event materials collected over the years. One brochure slipped from a stack and landed on the floor. Cole bent down to pick it up. As he glanced at the cover, he froze. The brochure advertised a sports leadership conference from more than 20 years earlier. Several featured speakers appeared in a group photograph. One face immediately stood out. Younger, stronger, but unmistakable. Cole stared at the image. His heart skipped a beat. "No way," he whispered. The face belonged to Marcus Reed. The officer quickly sat down and examined the brochure more closely. The name beneath the photograph was partially obscured by a fold, but enough remained visible to confirm what he was seeing. Marcus had once stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people. The realization left Cole stunned. Across the prison yard, Marcus sat beneath the familiar shaded structure reading as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky. He seemed completely unaware that pieces of his past were slowly resurfacing all around him. Ethan had found photographs. Rumors were spreading. Officer Cole had discovered a connection from decades earlier. The mystery surrounding the quiet inmate was no longer growing smaller. It was growing larger. And for the first time, multiple people inside Redstone Correctional Facility were beginning to suspect that Marcus Reed had once been far more than anyone had ever imagined. Friday morning arrived with an unusual energy inside Redstone Correctional Facility. The rumors that had quietly circulated for days were no longer confined to a handful of curious inmates. More people had begun noticing Marcus Reed. Not because he changed anything about his behavior. If anything, he remained exactly the same. He read his books. He followed his routine. He spoke only when necessary. Yet the discoveries made by Ethan Brooks and Officer Daniel Cole had created a growing sense that something important was hidden beneath the surface. During breakfast, conversations drifted toward the same subject again and again. Some inmates believed Marcus had once been a professional athlete. Others guessed he had been a coach. A few dismissed the entire thing as prison gossip. Marcus appeared completely uninterested in all of it. He sat alone with a book open beside his tray and paid no attention to the discussions happening around him. Ethan watched from across the room. The older inmate's ability to ignore attention was becoming almost as impressive as the mystery itself. Later that morning, Officer Cole returned to the administration office carrying the sports conference brochure he had discovered the previous day. He had spent most of the evening thinking about it. The younger version of Marcus in the photograph had unlocked a memory he could finally begin to place. It was not just a familiar face. It was a face connected to achievement. Determined to learn more, Cole requested access to several archived public records available through educational resources used by the facility. His search was not official business. It was simple curiosity. Within an hour, he found something that made him sit perfectly still. A digital archive containing historical sports coverage displayed a collection of old competition results and athlete profiles. One article immediately caught his attention. The name at the top read Marcus Reed. Cole stared at the screen. The article described an athlete known for extraordinary discipline, international competition, and years of dedicated training. Additional articles followed. More photographs appeared. Some showed Marcus standing beside coaches. Others showed him receiving awards. The dates stretched back decades. Cole leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. The quiet inmate reading books in Redstone had once been far more accomplished than anyone realized. Yet what surprised him most was not the success. It was the consistency. Every article described the same qualities inmates now associated with Marcus. Discipline, humility, patience, focus. Time had changed his appearance, but not his character. Meanwhile, Ethan experienced a breakthrough of his own. During an educational period in the library, he returned to the damaged newspaper article and compared details with other archived materials available through the facility's learning programs. Several missing pieces finally began falling into place. The faded photograph, the repeated references to championships, the international events. The clues pointed toward the same conclusion. Ethan felt a mixture of excitement and disbelief. The answer had been sitting in front of everyone for months. Nobody had recognized it because nobody expected someone with such an accomplished past to quietly spend afternoons reading books in prison. That afternoon, recreation resumed beneath bright sunshine. Marcus sat beneath the familiar shaded structure while inmates walked laps and played games around the yard. Ethan approached carrying a notebook. He sat down beside him without speaking for several moments. Marcus continued reading. Finally, Ethan smiled. You really were somebody important, were not you? Marcus slowly lowered the book. For a brief moment, the older man looked almost amused. Important is a complicated word. Ethan laughed. That sounds like a yes. Marcus looked across the yard. Everybody is important to someone. Ethan shook his head. You know that is not what I mean. Marcus smiled but offered no further explanation. The conversation ended there. Yet Ethan noticed something different. For the first time, Marcus did not completely avoid the topic. It was a small change, but a meaningful one. Across the yard, Ryan Carter watched the interaction. He had heard enough rumors by now to realize there might actually be truth behind them. The realization created an unfamiliar feeling. Respect. Not because of whatever Marcus had accomplished years ago, but because he had never once used those accomplishments to elevate himself above others. As the afternoon sun slowly descended toward the horizon, the mystery surrounding Marcus Reed entered a new stage. The clues were no longer random pieces scattered across the prison. They were beginning to form a complete picture. And very soon, someone from Marcus's past was about to walk through the gates of Redstone and confirm everything. The following Monday began like any other at Redstone Correctional Facility, but by mid-morning something unusual had already happened. Officer Daniel Cole received notice that an approved visitor had arrived for Marcus Reed. That alone was not remarkable. Inmates received visitors every week. What caught Cole's attention was the visitor's age and demeanor. The man appeared to be in his late 60s, dressed neatly, carrying himself with quiet confidence. He checked in, completed the required procedures, and waited patiently in the visitation area. When Cole glanced at the visitor log, he noticed the name, Victor Alvarez. The name immediately triggered a memory. Cole had seen it somewhere during his recent search into Marcus's past. Not wanting to jump to conclusions, he said nothing. A short time later, Marcus entered the visitation room. Ethan was nowhere near the area, but word traveled quickly inside Redstone whenever something unusual occurred. Several inmates had already heard that Marcus was receiving a visitor. Most paid little attention. Ryan Carter found himself unexpectedly curious. Meanwhile, inside the visitation room, Marcus stopped walking the moment he saw the older man. For the first time in months, perhaps years, genuine surprise appeared on his face. Victor stood slowly. The two men looked at each other for several seconds before smiling. You got old, Victor said. Marcus laughed softly. You got older. Both men shook hands warmly before sitting down. The conversation that followed remained private, but officers monitoring the room noticed something rare. Marcus spent most of the visit smiling. Not politely, not out of courtesy, genuinely smiling. Victor spoke with the relaxed confidence of someone who had known Marcus for decades. At one point, he reached into a folder he had brought and slid a photograph across the table. Marcus looked down at it and laughed again. Whatever memory it contained clearly meant something. After nearly an hour, the visit ended. As Victor prepared to leave, he placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. They still talk about you, you know. Marcus shook his head. They should not. Victor smiled. That is exactly why they do. The older visitor walked away while Marcus remained seated for a moment, thoughtful and quiet. Later that afternoon, Officer Cole reviewed the visitor information again. This time, he searched the name Victor Alvarez through the same public archives he had previously used. The results appeared almost immediately. Coach, trainer, international competition consultant. Multiple articles connected the name to elite athletic programs from decades earlier. Cole leaned back in his chair. The pieces were finally coming together. Around the same time, Ethan noticed Marcus returning from visitation. The older inmate appeared calm as always, yet there was something different in his expression, a sense of reflection. Ethan approached carefully during recreation. Good visit. Marcus smiled. Very good. Ethan nodded. An old friend. Marcus looked toward the recreation yard. One of the oldest. Ethan hesitated before asking the question he had wanted to ask for days. Was he your coach? Marcus turned and looked at him. For several seconds he said nothing. Then, surprisingly, he answered, "Yes." Ethan blinked. It was the most direct response Marcus had given about his past. "Coach of what?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Now that would ruin the mystery." Ethan laughed, but his heart raced. For the first time, Marcus had confirmed something. A coach. Not a teacher. Not a guess. A real coach. Across the yard, Ryan watched the conversation unfold. He could not hear the words, but he noticed Ethan's reaction afterward. The younger inmate looked stunned. That evening, rumors spread faster than ever before. The visitor had known Marcus for decades. The visitor had been a coach. Officer Cole had uncovered connections to major athletic events. More inmates began discussing possibilities. Some theories sounded ridiculous. Others sounded surprisingly believable. Through it all, Marcus remained unchanged. He read his book Beneath the Evening Lights and ignored the speculation surrounding him. Yet inside Redstone, something had shifted. The mystery was no longer about whether Marcus had an extraordinary past. Nearly everyone now believed he did. The only remaining question was what that past actually looked like. And very soon, the answer would become impossible to hide. Tuesday morning brought a feeling of expectation that seemed to spread through Redstone Correctional Facility without anyone fully understanding why. The rumors surrounding Marcus Reed had reached nearly every housing unit. What began as curiosity had become a genuine search for answers. Ethan Brooks carried more evidence than anyone else. Officer Daniel Cole possessed pieces of the puzzle from a different direction, and Marcus himself continued moving through each day as though none of it mattered. During recreation, Ethan found Marcus sitting beneath the familiar shaded structure with a book resting on his lap. The older inmate looked peaceful, watching sunlight move across the yard. Ethan sat beside him. "Can I ask one more question?" Marcus smiled. "You say that every time." Ethan laughed. "Because I keep getting new questions." Marcus nodded. "Fair enough." Ethan took a deep breath. "What was your greatest achievement?" For several moments Marcus remained silent. The answer, when it came, surprised Ethan completely. Learning that achievements do not last forever. Ethan frowned. "That sounds like avoiding the question." Marcus looked toward the horizon beyond the prison fences. "No, it is the answer." Before Ethan could respond, an officer approached. "Reed, visitation office needs to confirm some paperwork from yesterday." Marcus nodded and stood. As he walked away, Ethan felt both frustrated and fascinated. The older man had an unusual ability to answer honestly while still protecting parts of his story. Later that afternoon, Officer Cole finally decided to stop relying on fragments and assumptions. He requested permission to review publicly available records connected to the sports articles he had already discovered. The information confirmed everything. Marcus Reed had competed at the highest levels of international Muay Thai during his younger years. He had earned championships, recognition, and respect across multiple countries. More importantly, every source described the same qualities that inmates now observed daily: discipline, humility, patience, self-control. Cole sat quietly for several minutes after reading the final article. The answer that had haunted him for weeks was finally clear. Meanwhile, Ethan experienced his own breakthrough. One of the archived sports articles he had been studying included a restored version of the damaged photograph he had originally found. This time the caption remained intact. He stared at the name beneath the image. Marcus Reed, International Muay Thai Champion. Ethan leaned back in his chair, stunned. The mystery was over. Yet somehow the truth felt less important than the lessons Marcus had been teaching all along. That evening, word spread quickly. Not through official announcements. Through conversations. Through whispers. Through inmates comparing discoveries. Within hours, many people inside Redstone knew the truth. The quiet man who spent his days reading books had once stood among the most respected competitors in his sport. Some inmates reacted with disbelief. Others reacted with admiration. Ryan Carter sat silently at a table in the common area processing the information. The realization forced him to revisit every interaction he had ever had with Marcus. The shove in the cafeteria. The calm responses. The refusal to seek recognition. Suddenly everything made sense. Later that night, Ethan approached Marcus one final time. The older man sat reading beneath the evening lights exactly as he always did. Ethan smiled. So it was true. Marcus looked up. What was true? Ethan laughed. You know what I mean. For the first time, Marcus did not deflect. He simply closed the book and nodded. Yes. Ethan sat down beside him. Why never tell anyone? Marcus thought for a moment. Because it happened a long time ago. People would respect you. Marcus smiled gently. Respect based on old trophies is fragile. Ethan considered that. Then what matters? Marcus looked around the housing unit. Several inmates were reading. Others were talking quietly. A few were studying educational materials. Who you are when nobody knows your story, he said. The answer stayed with Ethan long after the conversation ended. Around them, Redstone continued its usual routine. Yet something had changed. The mystery that once surrounded Marcus Reed had finally been solved. Everyone now knew he had been a champion. But the revelation created a deeper understanding. His greatest victory had never been the championships. It had never been the recognition. It had never been the applause. His greatest victory was the ability to remain humble after achieving all of it. And for the people who had spent months wondering who Marcus Reed really was, that lesson proved far more powerful than any title ever could. The following week settled into a rhythm that felt familiar and completely different at the same time. Life inside Redstone Correctional Facility continued according to schedule. Breakfast arrived at the same hour. Recreation periods followed the same routine. Officers conducted the same counts. Yet the atmosphere surrounding Marcus Reed had quietly changed. The mystery was gone. The questions had been answered. People now knew that the quiet black inmate who spent his days reading books had once been an international Muay Thai champion. What surprised everyone most was not the accomplishment itself. It was the fact that Marcus had never used it to gain status, attention, or influence. On a cool Thursday afternoon, Marcus sat beneath his usual shaded area in the recreation yard with a book resting on his lap. Ethan Brooks joined him as he often did. Nearby, several inmates exercised, walked laps, or sat talking beneath the afternoon sun. For a while neither man spoke. Then Ethan smiled. You know, most people would have told everyone. Marcus looked up from the page. Told everyone what? Ethan laughed. Everything. Marcus closed the book. Then they would spend their lives talking about who they used to be. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Before he could respond, another figure approached. Ryan Carter. The yard seemed to grow quieter as several inmates noticed him walking toward the bench. Months earlier, Ryan had been the first person to challenge Marcus in the cafeteria. Now his expression carried none of the arrogance that once defined him. He stopped beside the bench and looked at Marcus for several seconds. Can I sit down? Marcus nodded. Of course. Ryan took a seat. For a moment nobody spoke. Finally Ryan exhaled. I owe you an apology. Marcus listened quietly. When you first got here, I judged you. Ryan looked toward the fence surrounding the yard. Actually, that is not true. I did not judge you. I dismissed you. Marcus remained silent. Ryan continued. I thought being loud meant being strong. I thought respect came from making sure everybody noticed you. He shook his head. Turns out I was wrong. Ethan watched carefully. Marcus studied Ryan for a moment before smiling. Most people spend part of their lives being wrong. Ryan laughed softly. That is probably true. Another brief silence followed. Then Ryan asked the question that had been on his mind since learning the truth. What was the biggest lesson you learned from all those years? Marcus leaned back and looked across the yard. The afternoon sunlight reflected off the windows of the housing units. Inmates moved through their routines. Somewhere in the distance an officer called out instructions. The moment felt strangely peaceful. The biggest lesson? Marcus repeated. Ryan nodded. Marcus thought for a few seconds. The strongest people are usually the ones who no longer need to prove they are strong. Ryan lowered his eyes. The words landed harder than any speech could have. Ethan quietly wrote the sentence in the notebook he now carried almost everywhere. Marcus smiled when he noticed. Collecting quotes again? Ethan laughed. Maybe. The three men sat together for a while longer. No speeches. No dramatic revelations. Just conversation. As the afternoon continued, Ryan found himself asking questions about discipline, patience, and self-control rather than championships or trophies. Marcus answered each one with the same calm honesty he had shown from the beginning. When recreation finally ended, inmates began returning toward their housing units. Ryan stood first. Thank you, he said. Marcus nodded. Take care of yourself. Ryan smiled. I am trying. As he walked away, Ethan watched him disappear into the crowd. The change was unmistakable. Marcus had never defeated anyone. He had never demanded respect. He had never used his reputation to influence people. Instead, he had changed lives through patience, humility, and example. That evening, as the sun set beyond the prison walls, Marcus returned to his bunk and opened another book. Around him, conversations continued. Television screens flickered. Cards shuffled across tables. Life moved forward. Yet for many people inside Redstone, the quiet inmate had left a lesson that would remain long after the story of his championships faded. Because in the end, the most remarkable thing about Marcus Reed was not that he had once become a champion. It was that after achieving everything, he had learned that character mattered more than recognition, humility mattered more than status, and the greatest victory a person could ever earn was mastery of themselves.